Thank you so much for having us come along. Mel and I are senior research officers with the Child and Family Evidence team at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. So the project that we work within is Child Family Community Australia, and this is a Department of Social Services funded project with the intention of getting a broader sense of the topics and areas that people in the child family welfare sector are working within, and the gaps that they might have in terms of evidence and how to use that in practice. So one of the areas that our audience was really interested in, and that I'm sure you're probably pretty aware is pretty topical at the moment, is coercive control. And through stakeholder engagement with our users, we've got about 40,000 subscribers to our content. Through engaging them in the topics that they need information about, and then going to stakeholders in industry like peak bodies, policymakers, practitioners and academics, we start to kind of piece these evidence packages together. So Mel and I have been working on this one about coercive control. And our desktop search and stakeholder engagement told us that a really important area for practitioners to appreciate and researchers as well is technology facilitated coercive control. I want to give a bit of a shout out because this presentation is just Mel and I that you'll see today, but it's based on a broader synthesis that we have done of the literature in this space, quite broadly on coercive control, and then a subsection of it on technology facilitated coercive control. This content comes from a short article that we've put together for practitioners, kind of highlighting the key information that the evidence can tell us about some tips for practice. But it wasn't just Mel and I that worked on this one. It was also a colleague that we have in-house, Dr. Mandy Truong, and also a collaborator that we have from Fed Uni, Dr. Evita March. So shout out to them for their input into this project. And yeah, so we're going to focus on the findings for this short article from an evidence synthesis, but there, as you probably appreciate, is often this kind of lag or gap that occurs from what we know in evidence or in emerging areas of actually having evidence that says not just what does this look like, but what works in practice. We don't quite have that in this area, not anything that's really robust. And so today we'll just focus on what the research can tell us. Alrighty, so thanks to Robin for already doing an acknowledgement of country. I just want to jump in as well. Mel and I are based in South Bank in Melbourne at APES. And so I'd like to also acknowledge the peoples of the Kulin Nations. In particular, the lands that we're on is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Bunurong people. I actually started my career in academia and research on Wiradjuri country, which I think a lot of the people who are joining us today are also on Wiradjuri country. So I like to throw in a little bit of respect and acknowledgement there as well. Okay, so what are we talking about today? We're looking at the findings from a rapid review of the international literature and trying to take from that evidence-based insights for practitioners who are supporting victim survivors. So really, what we're trying to do here is present something for non-specialist practitioners working in areas that increase the likelihood of exposure to women and children experiencing coercive control, but that don't have specialist training or experience in family and domestic violence. So let's, I guess, take a step back and have a talk about what coercive control is. The literature in this space is kind of characterized by a range of different approaches to coercive control. So within our work, we're broadly working from this definition that comes from Anne Rose. Coercive control is the overarching context that intimate partner violence occurs within. It's a kind of male power where physical and non-physical violence is used to subordinate and control the female victim survivor. It involves ongoing, repetitive, and cumulative tactics that impact the victim survivor's autonomy, liberty, and equality. So We're not talking about one-off incidences that might occur within the home between family members or intimate partners. We're talking about that pattern of ongoing cumulative tactics. So when we talk about technology-facilitated coercive control, we're talking about when technology is used as a means to extend the perpetrator's ability to monitor and maintain surveillance, harass, threaten and shame victim survivors, manipulate their social relationships, and to ensure compliance with demands, to be able to monitor and see if the things that they're expecting the victim survivor to do, that they're actually doing it. And also importantly for practitioners, that issue around actually accessing support, being able to monitor and surveil that. I do want to pause before we move ahead, because something that's really important to highlight is a key limitation within the literature, at least the empirical literature in this space in Australia and internationally, is that we don't have kind of an adequate picture or sense of what coercive control might look like for couples where it's not a male perpetrator and a female victim survivor. So there's LGBTIQ plus experiences that aren't reflected here. And also there is grey literature accessible that talks a little bit about what it might look like when we have males being victim survivors of coercive control. The key thing, I guess, is to just acknowledge that up front and think about those of you who are practitioners as well as doing research and academic work, is that the literature in this space can't kind of answer those questions for us confidently or think about how we might work with those groups. Always it's important to listen to the voices of the people that we work with regardless, but I just want to acknowledge up front, this is a gap in the literature. Alrighty, so Mel and I are going to cover kind of tag team and cover 5 different things for you today. The first is to talk about what does tech-facilitated coercive control look like. The second is to look at interactions between face-to-face and technology-facilitated tactics. And then we're going to talk about client groups who may be at an elevated risk of victimization, going on to outcomes associated with experiencing tech-facilitated coercive control, and then finish up with some practitioner insights that we've also had some input from practitioners that we're developing this content with for that webinar that I'll tell you a little more about towards the end. It's beyond the scope today and potentially beyond your kind of interests and attention spans for an afternoon to talk in detail about the methods. We kind of wanted to focus really specifically on what the research tells us. Obviously, more than happy to field any questions that you might have at the end about methods and some of the limitations within the broader research. Similarly, you might go away and have a think about this and want to reach out later. And you can feel free to do that. We're happy to share our slides. And I'll also share my contact info at the end of the presentation in case you want to reach out later. Alrighty, so what does technology coercive control look like? What are the tactics that are used to enact coercive control? The key thing to think about here before we look at these specific dot points is whatever is going to be effective in coercing and controlling an individual is really dependent on what's important to them. So this list here is, it's not a definitive list. It's an example of what comes through in the Australian and international literature. Things that have been measured and identified as behaviours, but it's by no means kind of exhaustive. So we know increasingly research is looking into how perpetrators might use children and also pets in this process as well. So this gives us a good starting point, but also in working with victim survivors, it's important to kind of hear their experiences and how they've uniquely been impacted. So some of the things that comes through in the research is harassment on social media, stalking using GPS data, clandestine and conspicuous audio and visual recording. So sometimes victim survivors know that they're being recorded or listened to, and sometimes they don't. The benefit of having somebody else know that you're listening or watching is, you don't have to be watching for them to conform the way that you want them to conform, I guess. So sometimes perpetrators will make this more or less obvious depending on the outcome that they want to achieve. Threats via SMS, monitoring emails, accessing accounts without permission. This could be bank accounts, this could be profiles or online services. So trying to access things like Centrelink or support services, impersonating a partner, what we call doxing, which is publishing private information with the intent to hurt another person, creating or sharing sexualized content without consent. This one's really important, especially if we're working with or researching young adults, because we're seeing this come out in the research increasingly in relation to dating apps. So the content could originally be shared consensually and then be used later when the relationship dynamics change and a perpetrator wants to maintain sexual or romantic relationship with someone who no longer wants to be in that relationship. So threats of sharing videos or images that might have previously been created consensually is a tactic that's used, but also the kind of conspicuous creation of this content happens as well without consent or forced as well. Controlling access to technology, using social media to interfere with relationships. And this final one that we're kind of seeing more and more information come out about is the way that children are used in the process. So a perpetrator might try to get passwords to the victim survivors' various accounts or phone from children. They might use the kids in the family to transport tracking or surveillance devices into the home or into the car. And they could also use phone calls, video phone calls, under the guise of, wanting to have a more engaging conversation through video to work out milestones in the background and find out where the kids and the or other victim survivors are. So I'm going to hand over to Mel in a sec. This is just a brief slide that I want to touch on just to highlight that victim survivors that experience tech-facilitated coercive control, it's very unlikely that that's the only, it's only technology that's being used. It's much more likely that they're also experiencing other kinds of abuse from the same perpetrator in person or via other means. So psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and unwanted in-person pursuit behaviors or stalking. And so these aren't mutually exclusive because we could be using technology to financially abuse someone or psychologically abuse them. The key point is it's very likely they're experiencing a combination of face-to-face behaviors and tech-based behaviors. All right, Mel, I'm going to throw to you for the next section.
Great, thanks, Jazz. So for this part of the presentation, I'm going to be covering which groups of women might be experiencing elevated risk of technology-facilitated coercive control. I'll then go into the research that looks at what impact experiencing technology-facilitated coercive control has on victim survivors. And then lastly, I'll cover some implications for practitioners from our review. It's worth noting here that this is an emerging area of research. So the groups of victim survivors that have come out of the research are not a definitive list. There may be, as Jazz mentioned, lots of gaps, particularly around LGBTQIA+ communities and other communities who aren't mentioned here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not also experiencing an elevated risk of technology-facilitated coercive control. And also these groups I'm mentioning here may not be mutually exclusive, even though they are sometimes looked that way in the research. And for me, the key thing that's really coming out of the key groups that have been identified so far is that the way technology can be used to both alleviate and also be exploited their sense of isolation. And each kind of group are going to touch on experiences a slightly different type of isolation, which may be either social or geographical. So the technology can be used by the women to give them a sense of autonomy and have connected to services and social groups. But then this, on the other hand, can be also exploited by perpetrators of coercive control. So the first one that first group that's been identified in the research is migrant women in Australia. These women might be reliant on technology to connect with social support systems from their home country. And they might also be financially reliant or dependent on the perpetrator of the coercive control. And this can be used to restrict or monitor their access to technology. And they might not be able to purchase or afford their own, technology to contact their friends without letting the perpetrator know. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. The second group of women who may also experience an elevated risk of technology-facilitated coercive control is women in regional, rural and remote areas of Australia. So these women may face geographical isolation. And again, technology can be a way to alleviate this sense of isolation in contacting social networks and services as well. This geographical isolation could be a barrier to accessing face-to-face services, particularly face-to-face intimate partner violence services. Also in these small, close-knit communities, sometimes the perpetrator of the coercive control can be quite well known and well liked. And this is also a barrier for these women to come forward and disclose the abuse that they're experiencing. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. The third group who have been identified in the research in potentially experiencing an elevated risk of technology-facilitated coercive control was women with a disability. And again, the theme of isolation comes out where these women can use technology to connect with social groups and also connect with support services that they need. And then on the other hand, this could be exploited by perpetrators to monitor the use of technology and find out personal information about these victim survivors. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. So moving on now to the impacts of this type of coercive control on the victim survivors. Again, it's worth noting here this is an emerging area of research. The impacts we reported here are not a definitive list. And most of the research comes out of victim survivors talking about the impacts on themselves and the experience that they had. Then the research cannot, at this point, highlight any causative links between experiencing coercive control and the impacts we've listed here. So a few different impacts have been found in the research. We found that coercive control impacts both the victim survivors' health and well-being, as well as their ability to engage in usual activities. Some victim survivors report facing difficulties engaging in work, education, and socialising. They've also reported they experience barriers seeking help from services and also social support systems. And victim survivors have also reported they experienced reduced confidence and self-esteem. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. Victim survivors also report that they experience a sense of loss, including the loss of the relationship with the perpetrator. They also have reported experience of a loss of sense of self, safety and freedom, and a loss of trust in technology. Victim survivors also report that they feel a sense of isolation and have reported mental health outcomes such as stress, fear, anxiety, and depression related to their experience of coercive control. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. As a result of the coercive control, victim survivors also reported that they feel more dependent on the perpetrator and feel more likely that they're going to exhibit self-harming behaviours. As Jazz mentioned, children of the victim survivors are sometimes used by the perpetrator to enact the technology-facilitated coercive control. And in these circumstances, victim survivors has reported a strained relationship with their children as a result of this. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. So to finish off the presentation, I'm going to cover some of the implications for practitioners. And these come out both from the research itself and also from conversations that Jazz and I have had with practitioners. This is an area that we'd love to get feedback from the people in this meeting as well, with how does this land for you? Are there other things that are missing, things that you found worked well in perhaps in your research, in your practice, or things that you've seen in the research as well? So firstly, it's important for practitioners to be mindful of their clients' confidentiality and privacy, and considering what information they're collecting from the clients and how is that being stored and protected. Practitioners can also discuss support options and action plans with clients, and being mindful that the victim survivor is the expert in their own experiences and the expert in what strategies might be able to keep them safe. A lot of the research emphasizes how disengaging from technology might not actually be a useful strategy and is unlikely to keep victim survivors safe from experiencing the coercive control. Instead, it's emphasized the focus should be on educating, encouraging victim survivors to be able to use technology safely. The eSafety Commissioner does have an online checklist that's for general domestic violence situations that is quite useful in thinking about how victim survivors can engage with technology safely and reducing their risk of experiencing coercive control. Victim survivors and both practitioners can reflect on their own digital literacy and how well they understand the way technology can be used to enact coercive control and where their gaps in knowledge might be. It's also important to remember that ultimately the perpetrator is responsible for enacting the coercive control, and they should be held accountable for this. And this accountability should not be pushed onto the victims and giving them undue burden to restrict their use of technology. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. At a service organisation level, practitioners can also consider how their practices or policies may increase or decrease the risk of their clients experiencing technology-facilitated coercive control. This is particularly useful when thinking about telehealth or telepractice and whether the client is able to engage in that in a safe way or whether that opens them up to any risks. And again, it's good to be mindful that perpetrators of coercive control often make the victims feel a sense of shame or guilt for their own victimization. And it's important to be mindful of the way language is used and to not inadvertently make victim survivors feel responsible or any sense of shame or guilt as a result of their own victimization. Next slide, thanks, Jazz. Practitioners can also continue to share their learnings and knowledge of how technology can be used in coercive control situations with other practitioners, and also discuss how this type of coercive control can interact and co-occur with other forms of violence. For victim survivors who are experiencing this type of coercive control, practitioners can refer them to specialist services, such as the National Domestic and Family Violence Council. However, there might be other local services in practitioners' areas that they also might be aware of that might be useful to refer their clients to. Practitioners can also consider whether they can provide a safe space for their clients and whether they can facilitate their client having contact with these specialist services. And they might want to familiarise both themselves and their clients with some of the online resources. Many of these websites have functions such as a quick exit button, or if you hit it when you're looking at the website, it will take the person to either a general Google search or a weather page. Great, now I'll hand back over to Jazz to finish off the rest of the presentation.
Okay, so I just want to pop this one here. If you think you want to get in touch later, you might want to take a little screenshot. Mel has the same email address except melissa.willoughby. You can also just find us both on the APES website. And we're more than happy to have a chat about any of this content later for you to reach out with any questions or insights that you might have. And we're both pretty active on social media as well. So it's good to build our professional network. So please feel free to reach out and keep in touch. And that's all we have for you today. I can share these slides if you're interested in having a read of some of the sources that we've talked about today and focused on in our synthesis.